I'd like to be the first to welcome all of our participants. We have a large group joining us today. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome. And we'd like you to come back. I'm Professor Tamer Çavuşgil, uh, International Business Professor at Georgia State University and Director of the CIBER Center, Center for International Business Education and Research. We've started these webinars since April when we felt the need to connect with our fellow educators, business people, and folks interested in international trade all over the world. And we built a great community thanks to your participation. And thanks also to our speakers who have come week after week and enlighten us. Typically, we discussed education, teaching related issues. We focused on research in international business. And also most recently, we featured trade issues and invited leading business executives, primarily from the region here, to enlighten us, to talk about their joys and challenges of international business. Today's webinar is very special because it is one of those that we do together jointly with Global Atlanta, which is one of the greatest assets in the region. So we have Trevor Williams with us moderating this discussion. Welcome, Trevor. Good to have you here. And Anis from Anisa International, welcome. Wonderful to have you here. And Scott Ellison from East West Manufacturing, welcome also. And Trevor is going to do much more needed introductions of our two distinguished guests. But let me also say Happy Lunar Year. As tomorrow, I believe, is the beginning of the Spring Festival. It's the beginning of a happy time. And this year is the year of the ox. And ox apparently stands for hard work and honesty, which is something we will be engaged in. We have been engaged this past year in a major way. This past year, obviously, has been a year of rebounding, recovery, and rebuilding. And as you will hear, these two companies and these two senior executives have done quite a bit of that. Not only rebounding very well, but also taken advantage of opportunities presented to them. So these two companies have had actually a double whammy in the sense that they had to deal with not just historical event, the global pandemic and the ensuing recession, but also a shock in terms of trade policies of the United States with China. And they've handled it well. You will hear about that. This year, of course, a key word this year has been resilience, something we talked a lot about with our students as well, as they needed to overcome the challenges in the face of many adversities, being distant, being remote, economic hardships, social tensions in our society, and more. So resilience is something we talk a lot about at the individual level, as well as corporate organizational level as well. And again, these two companies have built a resilient organization, resilient leadership, and we'll talk about resilient supply chains as well today. Today, our theme is decoupling. Perhaps, is it realistic to talk about reducing our dependence on our major trade partner, China, where we have a major, obviously, deficit in the goods trade, but we do benefit from a healthy services trade balance. So leaving politics aside, we'd like to focus on the realities of two businesses that have had long-standing relationships with China and how that has evolved this past year. So to lead us into this discussion is Trevor Williams. Thank you so much, Trevor, for joining us this morning. And I always say Global Atlanta is one of the biggest gifts to the region, not only the city of Atlanta, but the region and Southeast as well. And thank you, every thank you so much for everything you do for us, which is reminding us, educating us, and reminding us every day what an interconnected world we live in today, and even so more today than before. So Phil Bolton's vision way back in the 1980s was very appropriate, and still we feel that need today. Uh, I know, Trevor, you covered these two outstanding companies and leadership in Scott and Anissa in your Global Atlanta stories published in on April 9 and April 14. I went back and read those as well. So it was amazing how quickly they kind of responded, but a lot has happened today. So please bring us up to date.
Thank you so much, Tamir, and thank you to the Georgia State University Cyber for your support of Global Atlanta. We really couldn't do what we do without you. As you mentioned, Global Atlanta is an international business news service here in Atlanta, and we've been fortunate enough to track Atlanta's connectivity with the rest of the world, particularly with regard to business, but also on the educational, cultural, trade fronts as well for the last 30 years. This is our 30th year as a publication, so we're pretty excited about it. And yes, you're right. We have been able to track these two great companies, and I think the benefit of longevity as a publication is that you get to track progressions of various companies. It's not just a one-off story, but it's a relationship that continues to bear fruit. And I've been very fortunate enough to meet these two CEOs who have been kind enough to let a pesky reporter into their facilities over the years. And fortunately, during my visits to China, have been able to see both of their factories, or at least an earlier factory that Anissa had operated, and one that Scott operates with one of his joint venture partners. But I think one of the, as we get into introductions, I'm not going to read too much because I just want to weave some of this into the conversation. But I think probably the most important aspect of their titles is that they are both founders or co-founders and CEOs, not just executives that have come in to lead a company, but they're executives that have taken a company from the ground up and gone through the whole process of setting up factories in China and setting up international operations. And so I think maybe that's the most important part to emphasize. But Anissa Telwar Kiker has, I hope it's Kiker, is that right, Anissa?
Fine. Okay.
Okay, good. Kiker. Okay, good. I realized I should have cleared that with you beforehand. But founder and CEO of her namesake business, Anissa International, and started the business in 1992 and pioneered the leadership, product development, and culture of this globally branded business through the design and manufacturing of cosmetic brushes for makeup and skincare. And I think I'll stop there and we'll talk more about exactly what y'all do. But I just thank y'all for teaching me the word ferrule. I've been able to impress a lot of people by knowing what that part is between the brush and the handle. Yeah, there you go. so that's my my takeaway from that factory visit. But and really just seeing it all in process, and even that was earlier on before you had the state-of-the-art facilities that you have now. But it was already amazing to see the craftsmanship that goes into that work of an item that, you know, at least from my perspective, I don't think about a lot, but I know that many women around the world do. Scott is the CEO and co-founder of East West Manufacturing. Scott was before that, he was the VP of Offshore Manufacturing and Logistics for Diversitech Corporation, and then as he was going around the world to find factories to supply some of their parts, decided he could do that better, I guess, and wanted to create his own company to do that. And so I know he's got a much more, much deeper history than that, but I won't go too far into it because we'll get into the discussion here. I think another great thing to highlight about these two companies is Scott has been very intentional, especially in recent years, about opening factories in various other parts of the world beyond China. Whereas Anissa, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think y'all still have your your only plant in China. So I think it's a great way to look at the different strategies of different countries or different companies on diversifying and what that means. So welcome to y'all. Thank you so much for your time. And Anissa, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how y'all ended up in China in the first place. I know we're gonna go back into the history a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time reliving the glory days, but how did y'all end up very early after your founding in 1992, looking at China as a manufacturing destination?
So I always forget that you visited my plant, Trevor.
Yeah.
I think that you understand, because I think when someone sees our product made, it just opens their world, because they don't understand that it is a handmade product. It's an artisanal. And I was wondering how to explain today, because people ask me, why don't you leave China? It would be asking someone to make Italian wine in a different country, to make French cheese in a different country. I mean, maybe you could bring your raw materials in to do it as needed, but the craft of the brush came from, Japan, then it went to Korea, and now the handicraft, that intellectual property is in China. So that is where we are. And, as I mentioned, I started really in Korea with a distribution channel, a gentleman who taught me the trade, and he moved his facilities from Korea to China, again, because of labor cost. The raw materials at that time were animal fiber, which were coming from the north, from Mongolia, for goats and for horses. So that's how it started. Now it definitely has evolved. So how we will diversify when we think of that will not be leaving the region. But yes, we have to start to think about how are we going to match and continue to be competitive in a very a craft that's not going to change.
Yeah. Scott, what about you? I mean, I know you were going all over Asia looking at potential suppliers, and we've talked a lot over the years about supply chains and how important it is that within China, there are these kind of clusters of materials that are available for the manufacture of certain items like motors and things like that. But early on, like how did you, were you already going there for Diversitech, or how did you figure out that China would be the right place?
Thanks, Trevor. I mean, it started even earlier than that. I was, back in, it was scary when I had to think about how long ago it was at this point, but in 1994, which is 27 years ago, I was a global supply chain management consultant for PricewaterhouseCoopers, and my job was to think about how to set up global supply chains for big companies. And it was back then when I started realizing kind of the advantages and disadvantages of looking around the globe for manufacturing and distribution. And so I started recognizing then that there were, really strategic advantages to having products made in different places of the world. And a lot of that just depended on the product that you were going to manufacture. So that really was when the light clicked on for me that, there's a place in China to start manufacturing products to support manufacturing globally and here in the US. And so that's what got me started. And then in 1996, 2 years later, I started my first company in Hong Kong when I was 26 years old with my brother. And we were focused on making electronic products in China, back when it was largely toys that you saw coming out of China. And I knew that we could make a quality product anywhere in the world, that quality had nothing to do with location. It had everything to do with processes and controls. And so that's when we started getting more invested in helping companies kind of globalize and spread their supply chains.
Great. And I forgot, we should say 新年快乐 to all of our Chinese visitors or people who are maybe even joining us from China. I'm not sure if we have any folks like that, but which parts of the country did you land in respectively, and why? I mean, and tell us a little bit more about your decision-making process on how did you enter the country? Was it through a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, or was it through a joint venture? I know that y'all have different cases, and I know that there are a lot of companies trying to decide, where to be, and the decision-making process is very different now than it once was, I'm sure. Yeah. Scott, start with you, and then we'll go back to Anissa.
So we started in Hong Kong because we had some contacts there. My brother at the time, who I was working with back then, not anymore, but he had been living out there for already a good many years, and so we loved Hong Kong and a great city, and so we started there. and then set up our first operation in Shenzhen. And we started working with factories in the whole Guangdong area around electronics and plastics. That's primarily where that was being centralized at the time. And then we expanded from there over the years. We knew we were doing quite a bit in metalworking and metal processing, and that was more along the Western Belt, northern into China. And over the years, it's just continued to grow. So I mean, our supply chain in China today is close to 400 factories that are making products for us, all up and down the eastern coast of China and even further inland today.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because another difference between the two companies here is, Scott, you're most generally as contract manufacturer that helps other companies find the products, and you source them from various factories, whereas Anissa has her own factory. And I know you do too, Scott, through your
we have 8 fully owned East-West facilities today around the globe in China, but most of our China production today is produced in factories that we do not own, but we manage and oversee.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to your joint venture, because I think that might be instructive for people, your motor joint venture. But yeah. Anissa, how did you end up in Tianjin at the outset? Tell us a little bit about that.
So I'd learned about the region was very specific to brush making due to raw materials. So the partner I had, I was able to travel there, understand, and then a lot of brush manufacturers started to develop, their facilities. And then when I transitioned to having my own facility in 2002, it was where we needed to be because of the workforce. And it was the area I was familiar with. So there were Southern, and like in Shenzhen, which is very, popular also in this, but something I was used to. And we were able to, again, because of setting something up in China, understanding the government relationships that we had. So I was, again, lucky enough to open a WOFE. So I don't know if they do them as much anymore, which is a wholly foreign owned entity. And I was able to register, and so fully out in some aspects really own it. As much as you can own something in China, which
Well, I definitely want to get into that a little bit too, because I know that most recently you've had some interesting issues with your location, and you've stayed in that area. But we'll talk about that more. We'll lead into that. I think with the theme around decoupling and the way that your companies may be challenging that narrative, I wanted to ask just, how have we oversimplified the U.S.-China narrative, I guess? So, there are obviously labor cost, advantages to being in China, especially early on. And maybe the scale and the costs were big factors in driving a lot of companies to manufacture there at the outset. But can you talk about how that has maybe changed over time? I mean, we're talking about an almost 30-year period here that coincides with China's accession to the WTO and opening up to the world even further, and then now has come full circle in a way to, it seems like everything China is doing is sort of challenged on the security front by the U.S. So, how has the rationale for being in China morphed over the years and contributed to your decision about staying? Maybe Scott, start with that, because I think you have some interesting insight based on the fact that you're staying, but you're also going. You're diversifying in other places like Vietnam and India as well.
Yeah, so I think one of the areas that we've not appreciated, what in terms of China is the infrastructure and capital investment around certain areas of supply chain. And some things can be quite easy to pick up and move to another location. Like I think the first one that comes to mind is the textile industry, where the amount of capital to set up a sewing machine or a number of sewing machines is not very significant, and so that tends to be quite easy to move to other regions if you're just in search of low-cost labor. In China, there's I think of like our motor factory in Changzhou. Changzhou is well known for motors. It's a city about the size of Atlanta. And there's roughly 200 plus factories in Changzhou that are doing something around manufacturing of motors. We build full motor assemblies in Changzhou, but our supply chain is incredibly efficient in Changzhou because of all these proximate factories. And so we only need to carry 3 or 4 days of inventory, in our factory because all of our suppliers are right around us. Now, if we were to pick that up and say move it to another region, we would have to carry considerably more inventory, and our lead times would get longer because we would not be able to find that concentration of a supply chain in anywhere else in the world. So if I were to go to Mexico, or if I were to go to India or something like that, the capital costs to do that were prohibitive. So even if the costs of China of the motor itself are going up because of labor, it's relatively insignificant compared to, I would say insignificant, but it's small by comparison to the advantages we have around the supply chain efficiency.
Yeah, Anissa, do you feel similarly about your area, or is it more related to the people know-how than it is about the physical supply chain?
I think, I look at my relationship with China in a microcosm, and we have very strong relationships. Again, when I started, I had a lot of Korean management. That's how we started the facility. All my leadership now is Chinese. So the understanding of the cultural, impacts we have on economically, through policies, through commitment we have from that region, they've invested in us. It is so layered. And so that's why when things happen, we do have partners there that actually would care if we were to leave. Because the way we've run the business to be in a global culture, they want us to stay. So this is important. And yes, it has to do now with my workforce, which is very important to me. I don't know who's going to want to make a brush in 20 years, maybe in China. We are advancing our intellectual ability to manage and to automate and to everything that we're doing. And when I first arrived in China, and I look at the ability for the people to process information and for improvements, it's changing, it's evolving. And so I want to be part of that because I'm very, very invested. They're very invested. And that is just what I'm having to deal with. And we are dealing, there's a better supply chain in South with a lot that we do. So we're trying to figure that out a little bit more. The environmental that China is really invested in, improvements, that's not happening in other countries. I want to stay because I think that China is only going to get better. Yes, maybe it's going to be more. So I got to figure out how to create efficiencies and find customers here in the US who want transparent manufacturing. I think that's where I'm also really trying to partner. We want sustainable manufacturing. And in China, I can do that.
Yeah, I think some people would see that as like a oxymoron, right? But I think you're bringing up a great point, which is that for anyone who's ever been to China knows that something is completely true in one place, completely not true in another place within China. You can't generalize at all. So early on, you built out your own, I remember this from the factory visit, you built out your own water treatment facility, because you were anodizing and you had a lot of, I guess, chemicals going into the water, and you were trying to return it back to the environment in a better state. And that was at that time not required, but can you contrast that with, the fact that you've just moved to a bigger plant and I think have been compelled to move because of the strategic plan of the region?
So if you know of China, things change quickly, and what's going to be important. So 18 years ago, when we started the facility, we were on agricultural land. My workforce was a village next to me, a village of 30,000 people. And that is how we worked very well till 2009. And for us, the recession hit, and something, again, having to look at what was going on with China too. I think the awareness of how they were being impacted, increasing their labor costs, social insurance started to become important to them. And then the environmental impact started to happen in around 2010, 2011, 2012, where they were shutting our facilities down. They were shutting facilities all around us down that were polluting the environment through metallization, anything that would, because they were seeing their children getting cancer. And also Tianjin is very close to Beijing, and Beijing was not tolerating what was happening. Plus you had the Olympics happening. So you had all this convergence of awareness in China that they wanted to be outwardly a clean country, but they also saw the impacts. And so being an American company, we got hit pretty hard. Like the standard that we have to uphold in China is very different. And I'm not saying that's changed today. You can buy a brush on Amazon that was not made sustainably. And it is what it is. How our regulations and standards are going to be different. So yeah, so that being said, it's going to be constant for us. But I kind of welcome it because the companies I work with, like Estee Lauder, L'Oreal, Procter and Gamble, they want me to, to do this. So I have support too.
So how did that play into your decision you've got two facilities now, like one that's focused on anodization and one that's focused on the manufacturing of the brushes, as far as I understand. So how did all that you just said play into your decision to kind of move and stay in that area?
Well,
I would imagine that this would be an opportune moment to think, okay, should I still be here? Like kind of reevaluate everything.
I did. But I had 500 workers and 300 of those have, again, this intellectual property where they can make a product they've been making for the last 10 years the same way. So no matter where you buy it globally, it's the same product. Yes, we assessed it and we had to leave. They were telling us we're shutting down your facility, which was not fun. We had to move. So we had to bifurcate and we created an automation facility in a really clean industrial zone for the Farrell, which now is closed loop for water and air. That was a big investment. And then the other facility, the assembly, we moved into another zone, which was very difficult to find. It's not easy. I can get into all the minutia about and the fire regulations and it has been tough for the last 5 years. I do not have a fire certification where I was previously, where the fire department hoses could not come to my facility, so I had to build my own. But then, was it built correctly? Maybe not. There's a lot you can get away with or used to be able to get away with that we at this point, I do not want to run my business like that.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings up a good point. I mean, the fact that you had all of this experience yet still stayed, I think, largely because of the workforce, I think that says something about how resilient China's manufacturing base is and how hard it's going to be, if you have these, trade policies that are geared towards these, transactional kind of ideas that if we just raise the cost in China, then everybody's going to move their factories back. Obviously, that's an oversimplification. And Scott, I wanted you to bring you back in on that point. Like what are the kind of drivers of resiliency of the Chinese manufacturing base that you've seen, and what are the areas where we will see some of that move away from China to other either lower cost or better suited or less politically tenuous countries?
Well, I think it's all been an evolution, just like we saw, the U.S. evolving in the 20s and 30s, and Japan, and things were being manufactured in Japan in the 60s and 70s, and that started moving out, and Taiwan then evolved, and China's been going through the same evolution, and now in a lot of different in industries, things are too expensive in China. So like textiles, which I mentioned earlier, those are getting moved to Myanmar, Bangladesh, Cambodia, where there's abundant labor, not great infrastructure, but and then other products are moving to other regions, Central America or Vietnam. Obviously, that's been an area of significant growth. And so, in our space, it really depends on the product and what goes into it and the complexity of the supply chain that can determine where it's best to be manufactured. And, in some cases that might be the US, in some cases it could be somewhere entirely different. It's always changing, but material tends to be in our space a bigger, and just for reference, we make relatively complicated high-tech products in robotics, medical, connected devices. We're in a lot of different industries, and we sell to quite a few large Fortune 500 companies that are in technology. And so we're always first looking at the supply chain, since that tends to the materials that, could be hundreds or thousands of parts that go into these things. Could be 70% of the total cost of the product. So we have to figure out where are the best locations for that. And then if labor only makes up 10 or 15% of the cost, then that becomes less of a variable. So all those things have to be measured for us to find the optimal place to manufacture. And the reality is, now owning 4 plants in the U.S., we have 800 employees in the U.S. We have operations in Costa Rica. We're soon to have a plant in Canada. The average worker, on an assembly line in China is probably 1/4 of what you would pay in the U.S. For the cost of healthcare and for a U.S. employee, you can still hire 1 or 2 employees in China, and that's still increasing in the U.S. at a faster rate than the cost of labor in China. And so, are things, does it make sense to transition things to Vietnam, where the cost in Vietnam is probably 1/4 of China? So all those have to get weighed into how relevant that is against what's best for the product.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. I mean, and labor is not, so there's nuance to all this, of course, but even the labor equation is not so much just the factory floor labor, right? Like from what I understand, a big expense in China is getting the management that you need, because that's become really competitive.
Yeah, we're machine operators. Our biggest customers in the robotics business, and it's the plant that we use to make these parts is a massive facility, and they have several hundred machining centers. They have very large, high pressure investment die cast machines. There's really nowhere else in the world that has this level of capability to produce at this kind of scale. And so, and we've been looking to trying to find alternative locations just so we can diversify and not be so concentrated there. And there really aren't that many options. And if there is an option that is at a much smaller scale, it's the costs are considerably higher.
Yeah, Anissa,
even with tariffs.
Yeah, well, I want to get to tariffs for sure, but Anissa, did you have anything you wanted to add on the labor front? I know we'll get into how you adapted to COVID pretty soon, I think, but and I know that has to do with your management and how you got people back to the factory, particularly about almost exactly a year ago today. But did you want to talk anything about the difference between recruitment of the factory floor worker versus the managerial staff? You mentioned your leadership being all Chinese now.
Yeah, I mean, we're experiencing, I think, similar recruitment issues now, like we do in US, and we're trying to reduce our workforce now. I'm trying to do everything to become more efficient because it is a very competitive environment. And I recently just had a call with a customer yesterday. I couldn't believe what they were willing to pay, because it is impossible on to do it right. So I am really trying to seek out, again, like, it's hard to find a good engineer in the North. I need that. We're implementing ERP systems. It's very difficult to find people who can really, really support these well. Because again, it's this artisanal craft. It's a cosmetic brush. It's not automated. There's some things we can automate. Even my fancy barrel automation machine, we can't figure out how to do the right runs, like what we're describing. We're going through. It's been pretty tough. I hired a guy from Foxconn, but having a so,
it's different from an iPhone, right?
Yeah, and very savvy. The Chinese culture has evolved so much, and I am a big fan. I just need, I need to understand how to support and motivate, because sometimes it is difficult.
Yeah, well, and this is maybe a good time to mention that the Q&A box at the bottom is open, so we'll probably go for about 10 more minutes, and then I'll start to ask some, and Tomer can come back in as well, but we'll start to answer some of the questions that come in from the attendees. But one question was about the Chinese government, and is there evidence of their communist ideology in everyday operations? And I know how I feel about that. I think it's probably very, very diverse based on where you are and based on which level of government you're talking to. But Scott, do you want to talk about that at all?
No, I think China is one of the most capitalistic places I've ever been to. So, and in terms of government involvement, we've had very few encounters that I would say would be negative, or there's been areas where we've looked for when we did our investments there that were well supported, like you would expect in other areas. But I don't see it on a regular basis.
Mhm.
And it's been mostly positive in our respect.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you, y'all both mentioned tariffs, and the prevailing line of thinking under the Trump administration was that China's gamed the system. They've basically unfairly competed on the world stage, and to rectify that, we have to impose tariffs, which will then right the scales, bring some American manufacturing back. And I did note that after an increase of the trade deficit in the first year, obviously the trade deficit went down to only $310 billion in 2020. But of course, 2020 data you can sort of throw out because it's such an anomalous year in terms of global trade patterns. But I wanted to ask y'all what you think about, is there any credence to these ideas? I mean, where have you seen potentially troubling practices in your supply chains? And if so, what do we do about it? Like, how do we address, I know you're not government officials, but like, how would you advise policymakers to think about creating a sense of fairness in this relationship?
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I do think that it was appropriate. I think China, some changes needed to occur so that there would be a fair trade program. I personally have never experienced, we had in the 20 some years I've been having products made in China across a lot of different factories. We've had one issue with intellectual property that we were able to resolve. And we do make lots of products over there that have IP. But that said, I saw, we saw when China was entering the WTO, how much change they made within China to be part of that program because they knew it would be beneficial for them. And so, if we were trying to look at reforming some of the trade practices and encouraging that with China, it would seem to me that we would have been much better off not going it alone in that position. I think, had we, whether it be aligning with the TPP at the time or aligning with EU and creating kind of this consortium where we would define the rules of trade and engagement, then China would have looked at this and said, hey, I want to be part of that, and I know I need to make these changes to join to benefit from it. Mm. So I think, I'm not a politician, but if I were trying to persuade China and get these kind of policies in place, I would definitely have tried to done it through alliances and other trading partners.
It seems like that's the Biden administration's preferred approach. That seems like that's the direction they're going, because they haven't made any sudden movements. They haven't removed any tariffs yet. So we'll see how that goes. But Anissa, at your company level, like, did y'all feel the pain of the tariffs, or was your product not part of the regulations that came in?
I mean, we were impacted, I think, by the 10% that most were, and then there was some added later. Everybody was waiting if there was another 15%. The industry was definitely impacted if you had any type of metal, like compacts, lipstick cases. But the government supported us with the increases. They removed some of our social insurance impacts. They gave us some credits because they knew we were going to get hit. But the way I was also looking at this is that our products can be sold in China. So I think this idea of, it hurt us also that some of the restrictions China put on us, that we could no longer sell in China. That's one of the biggest markets in the world. I think and again, it wasn't smart, because now China's gotten really competitive and they've gotten outsourced to other countries what they were buying from us. I think that wasn't smart. Yeah. I eventually want to sell my products in China, and I would like a fair instead of competing against a Chinese factory, so that is what I would think would be smarter in some level. And also, if we did look at things, there's a lot of products that leave China that go into South America that have 30% duties and things that are much worse than coming into US. I mean, there could have been this more balanced approach. It is what it is. There's a lot I think we don't understand, and you know what's really going on, so
exactly.
One more comment, Trevor, on that front, if I may, because I think this is something that has been a misunderstanding around the tariffs, because we've experienced it firsthand. Many of the things we bring in from China are components that get assembled into some kind of finished product in the US. And so by tariffing those components, it's making the cost of the products that we're assembling in the US more expensive. And two things are possible. You can try and pass that cost on to your customer, or the more negative thing is it then incentivizes you to move the entire finished assembly to another region, let's say Costa Rica or Mexico, because then you can avoid the tariffs altogether. So it had a much bigger impact on the cost of our US operation and our ability to compete than I think most of the politicians realized.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Well, I wanted to talk, we're all experiencing, the effects of the pandemic these days, right? And, obviously originated in China, and right around this time last year when, companies were trying to gear back up for the post Chinese New Year rush, getting back into action. I know that's always a challenge anyway, but then it was extended 3 weeks or more by the lockdown, depending on where you were. And just wanted to get, I think it would be interesting for the audience to get a sense of how y'all had to react quickly to that. Maybe start with Anissa on that, because I know that, this was right around the time that you were opening this new facility, and you had to kind of track down your workers amid, all these different regulations and challenges in communication.
I'm trying to think when it first happened. It's almost, so it was very surreal. So I'd seen my team in November. Yeah, it was like, right. It was right around now. And thank goodness in China, because that's where it all started to be organized, where I thought they were going for Chinese New Year, something that they could not come back. And we were stuck in different villages they could not return. The government, again, is very, smart in how they communicate. Our teams got really, really tight, really, really fast. And I did not respect what they went through when they were on lockdown. I was like, oh, you're in your house, you're fine, you'll be, this will be over. My ignorance that this wasn't going to translate into Europe and to us is what I was shocked by. China has done a phenomenal job. My team has done a phenomenal job that we got to go back to work. The way they came in and really regulated us, even the way we ate lunch, the separations, all the masks, the temperature taking. We were one of the first factories to go back in our region. And it was because I had a new facility. I have to believe that everything was so beautiful and clean. So we got to go back to work. But yeah, it was a very surreal time. And I did not understand what they were going through till it hit us. But now we're doing Zoom calls. They're not wearing masks. We still are. They tested 300 of my people in 2 days to ensure nobody had COVID. I mean, they're pretty good, right?
Yeah,
they can handle it.
Very efficient. So Scott, tell me about, and you work with a lot of different factories, right? So I remember when I wrote that story about what y'all were doing and how you're adapting, I found it very fascinating that you were able to glean insights from all the various factories. Like your Shenzhen office had a team that was in charge of like contacting everybody, and so you had sort of almost like a survey of various regions. Yeah. How did that work?
Once we were able to get into the first, they wouldn't let us in our building in Shenzhen. So that was until we could, everybody had to get the green light on the app in their phone to make sure they were clean, and then they let them into the building. And then we would get daily reports from the factories as to how many employees they were able to bring in. In fact, we had a story in the Wall Street Journal because we had sent out vans and buses to some region because public transportation was shut down. And we were helping some of the workers get back to the factories so that they could get there and start making product for us. And we were just monitoring that, very fearful of, because we were going to be shutting down assembly lines all over the world without product being produced. And then, like you said, it was pretty fast. I mean, you know, one week you'd have 20% of the labor force, the next week you'd have 50 or 60, and then over a 3 or 4 week period, it came back to normal. And then right at that point, of course, the solution to save time is, well, we just got to start air freighting everything. And then air freight went up by like 3 or 4x all of a sudden, because everybody had the same idea we did. So that became, you know, it was all triage basically to work through to make sure we were getting customers their product when they needed it. But it was stressful, but we got through it pretty well overall.
Well, to Anissa's point, you know, at that point, you didn't really know that this was going to sweep the world, right? Like I still remember writing stories about, you know, in February of people sending stuff to China to help with the outbreak there, you know, not thinking, oh, this is going to come to us in a month. And so in that regard, like how did what you did or what you observed in China affect your other operations around the world? Like how were you able to come up with best practices and things like that helped your existing plants elsewhere?
So we created a list of, so we've got all our US operations, and we created a procedure. I think it had like 30 different action items on it. And we had a gentleman on our team whose job it was to make sure that everything was being implemented at all those sites, so that everybody could be as safe as possible, you know, from having your temperature taken before you got in the building, of course, the masking, the spacing, all that stuff. And we had really good cooperation across the company, and you know, cleaning the surfaces, et cetera. So that worked out quite well. We of course we've had cases here and there, but if we've ever had to quarantine I don't think we've ever quarantined more than 4 or 5 people at a time. And we've never, you know, knock on wood, we've not had any spread inside of any of our facilities. It's always been somebody that brought it in from somewhere else, and then never transmitted it to anybody else.
Yeah.
So we were, you know, incredibly cautious. We also created an incentive award. We called it a Patriot bonus for folks because they were afraid. People were afraid to show up to work. And so we wanted to recognize that and reward that. But, you know, something like 95% of the products we manufacture in the US are characterized as essential. We were making electronics for ventilators and respirators and ICU oxygen meters, et cetera. And so we needed people to do this work for us. And people stepped up, and we got it done.
Awesome. Well, Tamer, I'm not sure if do you want me to just launch into the Q&A box? We've got a lot of good stuff coming in here.
Yeah, I mean, great discussion, and thank you all for your insights and wisdom. And by the way, Trevor, we do have a lot of Chinese speaking folks. In fact, several people who are, I think, tuning in from China, and they praise your Chinese pronunciation of Happy Lunar Year. So that's wonderful. We have a lot of questions, comments. One question, I think we dealt, Scott talked about IP issues. Maybe we can skip over that one, but partnerships, you know, building partnerships with local business people. I mean, you always work with a partner, right? I mean, you hire vendors, for example, for your production there. I mean, how do you find, as their best practice in building partnerships in China? And obviously, one of the things you noted is that there's been a lot of building up, a lot of upgrading. China today is, in terms of the business infrastructure, commercial banking, etc., it's very, very modern, very contemporary, very efficient. So they've come a long way, but do you find particular difficulties in building partnerships with local business partners in China?
I mean, I think that's something that we've done particularly well. I mean, we've been doing this over 20 years, and you know, something that I think that has worked well for us. You know, just our culture and our style is to be very transparent and open. We say it like it is, and I think a lot of our partners in China are attracted to that. They like our style on that front, and you know, the trick, it's not very complicated. When we find partners we like to do business with, we ask them if they have any other folks they want to introduce us to. Certainly not in the same industry, but if we find a great supplier that's making plastics for us, we'll ask him if he has somebody he could introduce us to that might be making metal parts or might be doing something else. And so that network always grows because people want to introduce you other people that, that they know they have confidence in, that you can trust.
Mhm.
And so that's been how it's evolved for us. Now, I say we have over 500 active suppliers in China today for us. We have a lot more than that are suppliers that we've engaged with and then we've decided to move away from.
Mm.
So it takes a long time to build that kind of base that you can rely on.
Mhm. Anissa,
I'm
do
sure
you
you,
have any additional comments?
I was just going to say, Scott, I'm sure you learned a lot from your joint venture as well, which your
Mhm.
Yeah, I like to
counter.
say there were several years in there where I felt like I was in marriage counseling.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
joint ventures are tough. Often it was we would have problems, and I'd say, "Why are you doing this to me?" And he'd say, "It's because you're my partner and not my customer. You're too
yeah,
close."
yeah, yeah. Anissa, did you want to add something on partnerships?
Well, in the sense of building, we built facilities. So I think it's, getting we had to hire, the right people. Like I had someone on site who had done this before on very big levels in Beijing, understood what we needed to do. And I think, again, I'm not funding this. It's not like I'm asking for some, we are paying for this. So
Mm-hmm.
if you have the funding, I'm sure you can do what's needed in China and to do it right. It's again, regulations, certifications, making sure you have those but we were able to build, and, it's a small facility compared to what Scott, does, but, we put another $5 million just in the operation facility. The automation facility was only, $2 million, but I mean, that's a lot. That's now
Mm-hmm.
my capital that will be in China. So
Mm-hmm.
my hope would be that at some point I can recoup that, or over long term, the efficiencies we're going to gain because we have invested in these new
Mm-hmm.
facilities. So, you know,
Right.
yeah, my only concern is if there's more regulations that will come from China that I'm not aware of, if they will require us to do something else in these facilities. That would be my only concern.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, you talked about sustainability and the importance of when you're working with your customers, world-class customers such as Estee Lauder and so on. They want to know a lot about the production of what you pass on to them. One of the questions from one of our participants is about the ESG, environmental social governance initiatives. To what extent the Chinese government is serious about implementing these, like we are now paying a lot of attention in the United States. General flavor of the sustainability, but more so environmental implications. Do you see a trend along those lines? They're becoming more serious, more scrutiny-wise?
Yeah, they had shut down, I don't know if it was thousands of facilities, 2015, 2016, small facilities that could not ever invest in any kind of environmental. A lot of those facilities will just go further inland where they cannot be regulated. That is something that you'll see. It's more so with this, the type of, when it has to impact the water, when it has to impact the air. I mean, they can be caught, but they can also hide. So the government, with these larger facilities where you are, even Chinese facilities, I mean, I do think they want the improvements. It is important. I do think they don't want the dirty manufacturing that they've been okay with for years and years and years. But they're moving some of their own dirty manufacturing to Vietnam and they're not regulating it. You'll have Chinese manufacturers in Vietnam and in Thailand. I mean, so yes, China may clean up, but who are they now going to pollute?
You see it with the VAT tax refunds that they assign a bigger refund to companies that have less pollution associated with them. The other thing I would add is our biggest campus is down in Vietnam. We have 5 buildings down there and I don't know, 13 or 1400 employees. And we just built 2 buildings and the government helped us set up solar arrays across the buildings. So we're generating about anywhere from a third to a half of our energy is through solar panels on our own buildings. And it's somewhat subsidized by the government, and we pay for it over a number of years. I would be shocked if China wasn't doing very similar programs. I don't know firsthand, but I would expect they would be.
Interesting.
Burning of coal is all right. So they've been trying to eliminate that, and how
Yeah.
that. I mean, I haven't
Well,
been. I want
you
to
know,
go to the team. Like, what is happening? Go ahead, Scott. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I love this. Every time I go to China every year, I'm shocked by something that I think has dramatically changed over the last time I was there. And so 3 years ago, I was blown away that the fact that cash had just gone, that nobody used cash anymore. And they had the share bikes before we had the birds, and they had all those all over the place. And then I went back 2 years ago, and they had replaced all vehicles in Shenzhen, a city of 20 plus million people. All taxis, buses, and motorbikes were now EV, 100%. And the entire noise of the city had just changed overnight. And then last year when I was there, they had set up cameras because it was still kind of dangerous walking across the streets and the roads. They'd set up cameras over the entire city. And now all the cars were being monitored via AI. And if you stepped onto a pedestrian walkway, all the cars would immediately stop because they knew they would get a ticket if they were crossing when they shouldn't be. Now, if you're a pedestrian, and this is what was scary, and you crossed the walkway and you shouldn't have been, your picture and name would appear on a board because they had recognized you and they're calling you out as somebody that was, violating the law essentially. But here in a year, they were able to create that much change, and it was so quickly. It was just mind blowing. And so the technology advancements from the EV and China's going to be all electric cars, way before we are at the rate they're going.
And the sustainable materials, the PCRs, post-consumer type recycling, and the FSC woods. Like, you could not really get an FSC wood in China now. You can go see where they actually are doing the reforest, and it's real now. It used to be you could get a certificate for FSC from anybody, but now you can validate, and you can start to go deeper into the supply chain, and that's what we have to do. Who we purchase from, we have to require the same that we require of ourselves. But my thing is that when I go to Tianjin, the last time I was there, the sky was blue and there was no Olympics and it wasn't fake. So I was like, what's happening? So I am used to always having a very dark and dreary environment, and that is not the case anymore.
Right.
Interesting. Very interesting. We have a European participant, a business person, researcher, Henrik Arvidsson, who's asking an interesting question: the perceptions of the Chinese, of the Americans, and America in general these days. Post-Trump era, did we lose a little bit of a face or image, reputation? What do they think of us these days? It's interesting.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of questions too about the political environment and just how it might affect y'all. So I think to close out, it's probably good to address those two together.
I think we pay a lot. Well, as a living here in Atlanta, I think we pay a lot more attention to the politics than I think most of my Chinese partners do. I think in many cases they kind of look at that as something else. They're more focused on business and doing what they can control. Mm-hmm. So obviously there's been concern about the separation, and the tariffs, that I've heard from a lot of our partners in China, but I think that's largely dissipated at this point.
So my general manager, I asked him, he said, "You've made us stronger because Trump was so tough on them, or the administration." Yeah. They are very smart. So they're going to take the challenge and they're only going to improve themselves, is what he told me. I was like, wow, okay.
Well, certainly, yeah, China's, I'm not an expert in this area, but China, I think, is come out looking pretty good through all this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you've heard more about what they're calling the dual circulation strategy, right? So, do things internationally where it makes sense, but build up your own internal manufacturing base as well, simultaneously. So, yeah. They're certainly not lost for plans for what they want to do to address some of this stuff.
And they control all the messaging, right? Mm-hmm. And we get to air our dirty laundry.
So we may want to wrap up, maybe with some final thoughts, comments from all of you. There's a lot of questions, comments. We won't be able to get to them, but we appreciate all of our participants. We've had over 200 folks join us today. Some
Great.
final thoughts, perhaps, Anissa and Scott, Trevor?
I just want to say thanks. Thanks for letting me be a part of this, and just appreciate the chance to continue the discussion with both of you. And I hope to, once we are able to travel again, to go see Anissa's new factory and maybe add a third country to my East-West manufacturing tour at some point. So
Costa Rica.
Costa Rica,
Come see
yeah,
us
that sounds
there.
good.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Fun.
you.
All right, bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you for enlightening us, and we hope to see you again on another webinar. Thank you all, everybody who joined us today from around the world. Happy Lunar Year to our Chinese and other folks who are celebrating the Lunar Year, and look forward to seeing you at another webinar, and have a good day.
Thank you.
All right. 再见。